he collapsed. His friends, he had 2 friends with him, and they didn't know what to do. And
Right.
so, I mean, they did their best. They called the paramedics, but by the time the paramedics got there, it was too late, and he was just gone. No warning, no goodbyes. He was just gone.
Welcome to Stories of Hope in Hard Times, the show that explores how people endure and even thrive in difficult times, all with God's help. I'm your host, Tamara K. Anderson. Join me on a journey to find inspiring stories of hope and wisdom learned in life's hardest moments.
My next guest is the oldest of 10 children and grew up in California. She met her husband as a student at BYU, and they have lived in Utah for almost 30 years now and have 8 children. Through her husband, she was introduced to alternative medicine, and she has studied the healing arts for over 30 years. Her daughter, Glenna, was the first to be diagnosed with the hereditary heart condition, HCM, which stands for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This led to the diagnosis of her husband and 2 youngest children, Stephen and Jesse. I am pleased to introduce Elizabeth Allen. Elizabeth, are you ready to share your story of hope?
I am ready.
Awesome. So I understand you play the violin.
Yes, well, not as often as I would like to, but I do play still occasionally.
That's awesome. That is actually something I did when I was in junior high. I never became very proficient. In fact, if I still pick up a violin, I know how to read music with it, but it does not sound very beautiful. So I never got to the beautiful phase of that. So I am sure you did, since you still play.
Well, it's more because I love playing.
Yes. And it is a gift, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. So tell me a little bit about your family and this crazy diagnosis that kind of hit you guys out of the blue.
So when my kids were young, a lot of them would have trouble with like stomach aches, and, you just do your best to try and figure out what's going on. Some of them were diagnosed with H. pylori, but we never really knew that there was a problem until my daughter was living with my sister out in Connecticut, and one morning they couldn't wake her up, and they ended up calling the paramedics, and that led to testing. But the testing, they just were baffled. They said, "We've never seen anything like this." She has the EKG of a 90-year-old who's had several heart attacks.
Really?
They even sent her test results to Columbia University. They did like a heart monitor and treadmill tests, a lot of different testing, but they never did any imaging. And so they just remained baffled. Even Columbia University was like, "We've never seen anything like this." So when we brought her back home to Utah, we took her to our cardiologist who did an MRI, and that was when she was finally diagnosed. And he said, "This is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's hereditary. You need to get everybody in your family tested."
Wow.
And so that began, and our older children had already left home. So
really,
when they're not there, you can't drag them to the doctor and say, "We're doing this test," which basically is an echocardiogram. So they check to see if the muscle of the heart has thickened. That's how they diagnose.
So is that what it is? It's a thickening of the muscle of the heart?
Yeah, the muscle gets too thick, which makes the chambers that hold the blood smaller, so the heart can't pump as much blood. That's one of the problems. Plus, the fibers tend to be scrambled and stiff. They get scrambled and stiff, so there's pain. The heart will go into a fibrillation, and that's what causes the sudden death. So it's been known as the life snatcher because it's the young athletes who drop dead on the field or court. It's usually HCM, and it tends to go undiagnosed because in America they don't do any kind of screening or testing for it for our young athletes, which can be dangerous. So.
Oh, sure. So your recommendation then to parents who have kids who are in sports is at least rule this out then?
So yeah, if you and at least know the symptoms to look for,
Oh, tell us what they are.
which can be just like a low energy kid, a kid who gets tired a lot. You would want to make sure, kind of do some extra testing for a kid like that, because they just don't feel well. And they don't know, there's just not a reason. They like I said, they're low energy. And so, and an echocardiogram, and really echocardiograms aren't that expensive, but it would show that thickening, and it can be in different places. It can be in the septum that divides the heart. It can be at the apex. It can be in different areas, and there are different genes of HCM. So with our daughter, we actually we went to Stanford University because they had specialists there, and we did some like family genetic counseling. She actually got tested, and so we now that we know the specific gene, we know we can specifically test for that gene in our family, which is helpful.
Wow. Now, how many of your family members have this then?
So we know my husband has it. The only ones who haven't been either genetically tested for it or like with an echocardiogram is one of my sons, and then my oldest daughter, who actually she's been diagnosed with Lynch syndrome. So she's been dealing with cancer.
Bless her.
But my oldest son and then my one daughter, they were tested for the gene, and they both have it. They don't have the disease, though.
So you can be a carrier and not necessarily manifest it.
Yeah.
But you can pass it on.
And we have another daughter, and she's never been tested, but her two oldest children were tested, and one of them had the gene. So then we knew that she had it. And then she actually, her oldest son ended up having the disease.
Wow.
So
there you go. That is crazy.
It is, yeah, the odds aren't looking real great. I mean, so everyone who's been tested either has the gene or the disease. So that's where we're at so far.
So tell us a little bit about how this has impacted your family specifically then.
Well, so Jesse, I mean, he never complained.
How old was Jesse?
So he passed away when he was 16. It was 2010, July 7th. And he'd been having trouble, but it didn't really stand out until after he'd passed away. So he passed away, like I said, on July 7th. On the 4th, well, actually on the 3rd, he was like just bending over in the grocery store. He was with my other children, and they were celebrating the 4th, and his hand was shaking. And so they were noticing that he was having trouble, but he kind of had this invincible spirit about him, and he just, even though he was having trouble, like I said, he didn't complain, and he pushed himself. He did things like he signed up for weightlifting when he wasn't supposed to. And that was one of the problems with, as far as the school system worked, because when he was first diagnosed, he had a health plan, but it didn't follow him through to the high school. And so even though there was like no weightlifting, he still signed up for weightlifting, unbeknownst to us. When I found out, I was not happy. I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You're not supposed to do this. But he didn't understand why, and he just, he was strong and healthy looking.
Yeah.
Less than 3 weeks before he passed away, my daughter got married, and he just looked the picture of health. You would never guess. And so when he did pass away, he was out in Roosevelt, a couple hours away. He collapsed. His friends, he had 2 friends with him, and they didn't know what to do. And so, they did their best. They called the paramedics, but by the time the paramedics got there, it was too late, and he was just gone. No warning, no goodbyes. He was just gone.
Oh my goodness. So how did that impact you as a mom?
Oh, it just threw us all into a huge tailspin. Because, for one thing, my husband and 2 other children still had the disease. And so it's like, well, what does this mean? And then all of the stress of his death created more problems. So we were in the emergency room a number of times after his death, just because it was the fear and the stress was difficult for my husband and my other children.
Do you think it made you more paranoid for them?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because it's like, are they going to die too now? And so it's just, you learn to live life with that hanging over your head, but you just learn to live with it. And
how do you do that, though? Because I can imagine your anxiety and stress must have just skyrocketed.
So it was, I mean, it's been a journey. I mean, in July, it'll be 10 years, which I can hardly believe.
Right.
For me, I did a lot of writing. I wrote a lot of poetry, and then I've written a book. And the writing for me was very therapeutic, and it helped me a lot. And my faith, just having, my faith in God. And I have been fascinated with near-death experiences for years before Jesse passed away. So I already had a belief that, that this life isn't the end. And that brings you some comfort. It doesn't make you ever miss them less. I mean, that part never goes away. The thing about losing someone is the love doesn't ever go away. And because the love doesn't ever go away, you don't ever stop missing them. And that's the hard part, is just the missing them. But so I have focused on, every day is a precious gift. And, and then especially with my oldest daughter now, she's been going, in fact, she was diagnosed about almost exactly a year after Jesse passed away. Wow. And at first I was like, really, God, you would do this to me? I was, to me, it doesn't make sense to be mad at God, because what's that going to accomplish?
But sometimes we feel that way.
Yeah.
Right?
And sometimes, and actually my belief that it's wrong to be mad at God I just kind of stuffed down my anger and a lot of my emotions. And so it was actually writing my book that kind of helped me get in touch with a lot of the emotions that I had pushed down and ignored, and because they were either even with the healing work I do, I know that our emotions are important, but I still pushed them down. And I think that just growing up, that was how I coped with hard things, as I learned to just push them down, because I didn't know a better way to deal with them a lot of times.
Right.
Well, and plus I was punished when I was young for my, if I was crying, my dad would say, and he's Armenian, so he kind of had a different way of thinking, and he was pretty authoritarian, and being the oldest, I kind of got the brunt of it. But
yeah, poor oldest kids. I'm an oldest kid too. We can relate.
It was if you cry, I'll give you a reason to cry.
Oh, no.
So anyway, so I just learned to, stuff it down because it was safer.
Yeah, I can imagine that must have been awfully hard. I know after my kids were diagnosed with autism, I remember I felt very angry for a while with God. And I felt guilty on top of the grief. And I just don't think that's a good combination to have together. I think it's important that we give ourselves a little grace in there somewhere. I think God understands way better than we give him credit for. He knows exactly what we're thinking. He knows exactly what we're feeling. He knows that when we're angry with him, it's not like we're going to hide it from him.
Well, and he doesn't even care. In fact, I compare it to a parent with a kid who's throwing a temper tantrum. You don't sit there and go, you stupid child, why are you angry? And, even if they're saying, I hate you.
Yeah.
Which, one of my kids said that she hoped I'd die and she'd dance on my grave.
And you know what? We still love them, right?
Yeah. But, you don't sit there and hate them. You're like, well, I can tell you're having a hard time right now. And, you do your best to try and help them through it. But
yeah, I think you're right. I think God looks at us much the same way. So the lesson may be to just be okay with where you are
Mm-hmm.
and try to not stuff those emotions down. And maybe sometimes I think we might suppress the emotions because it's too much for us to deal with
Yes, I
at
know.
the time, don't you think? Especially when
yeah.
you're grieving something like a death.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like a volcano ready to explode, and you're like, I don't know what'll happen if it explodes. Maybe I won't survive it,
Yeah.
or other people won't survive it. So
Right.
it can be pretty intense.
So you were finally able to get those emotions out then when you started writing.
Yes. And yeah, they came bubbling up and went, ooh, there's the anger.
So it's going to come out sooner or later.
Well, and and it wasn't even conscious, but I wanted to feel control. And so I was looking for somebody to blame. And in fact, it's just recent. It's been such a journey. It just unfolds, over time. And so the latest thing is, I wanted to blame the paramedics, or I wanted to blame the doctors. I wanted to blame somebody. I wanted to feel like I could change the outcome, could have changed the outcome for myself, and could possibly change an outcome for other parents. But in reality, that's just not how it works.
Yeah.
And so the real lesson, the most recent powerful lesson that God kind of taught me is he helped me remember. So when Jesse first passed away, he was an artist. He had a lot of drawings, and he took classes at school. And he had one painting that he had done. It was like the face of the David looking down. And it looked a lot like him, kind of made me think of him watching over us from heaven. And I had gotten that framed, and I was trying to take pictures of it, and there was this green glare off the glass, no matter what angle I tried to take the picture from. And so finally, it worked. I was able to take pictures, and I didn't really think anything of it. I was like, oh, good, now it works. And so about a month later, I was doing a training, and I had an opportunity to talk to a woman who had gifts. She had some psychic gifts. And she told me, she said, he wants me to let you know that you're missing things, which just made me frustrated. I was like, what am I missing? Don't tell me I'm missing things and not tell me. But, and then it was shortly after that his light started showing up in pictures in the most amazing way. It's not like just a little, sometimes people will talk about orbs, but this was like a bright, huge light that would show up in the pictures.
Like of other family members you're taking pictures? Or?
So I was, so the most amazing one, I was with one of my daughters. We were at Chekarama. It was nighttime. We weren't by any windows. And we'd eaten some, and she said, oh, I'm tired. I'm going to lay down and sleep under her coat. And the first miracle that happened is my phone that I was using to take the pictures was really, really slow. It would take at least 30 seconds in between pictures to get enough power to take the picture.
Oh, gosh.
But in this situation, it just went click, click. It happened really fast. So don't ask me why I'm taking pictures of my daughter going under her coat. But anyway, this glare started. I thought it was a glare. This light started coming. And so and there was a clock in the background. So I thought, well, maybe it's a glare off the clock. So I angled way in, and the light just got brighter and more intense. And finally I went, oh, this is not a glare. And so I said, oh, Jessie. And my daughter heard me, and she popped her head out to go, what? What are you talking about? And the light was so bright, it covered most of her face. You could kind of see the outline of her chin and side of her face. And anyway, it was just amazing to see these pictures. And so she took my phone and she took some pictures. Anyway, so just seeing his light and then seeing it leave was just, and we could feel him. The most powerful thing about it is just feeling him. And her countenance, in the beginning it was tired and a little bit grumpy, like, don't take my picture. And then it was just radiant, because just having that connection. And that was one of the hard things for me, is I wanted to feel connected to him. And so the lesson that God was trying to remind me of, in reminding me of that, of taking those pictures, because it took me a while to go, oh, well, maybe I was missing his light. Maybe his light was coming and I just didn't recognize it at first. And sure enough, I went back to those pictures that I had taken of his painting. And what made it so that the glare wasn't there is his light. It was just a soft, diffused white light coming from the top. But I just had I didn't know what to look for. And so the lesson, the message that God was trying to teach me is, your expectations. So I was asking for dreams like everybody else was having dreams. And so I wanted dreams. But that's not how Jesse came to me. He came in pictures. His light came in pictures and continues to come. And as I've shared that with a friend of mine, and she shared it with a friend of hers who had lost a son as well. And sure enough, those lights can show up in pictures. And it makes me wonder how many people out there have, different gifts, different, that their loved ones on the other side trying to say, hi, I'm here and I love you, but you just don't recognize it. And so that is probably my biggest message is they're there. They love us. They want us to know that they're there, and they have different ways of showing up. Like they communicate a lot through music. And so he had a song. My sister used a particular song when she made the video for his funeral. And so that would come up and play on the radio a lot when he was around. So and so I've learned the different ways that they show up. And I love sharing that with other people because it can give them hope that they're not alone and that they're watched over and loved. And
that's really sweet. Oh my goodness. Well, and it's good to know that those we love, even though we can't see them, they're still alive. They're still there. That's very, very sweet. Now, you mentioned another one of the lessons that you learned was being able to surrender. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So I've had to learn to surrender, like my daughter going through cancer. With working in the healing arts the way I have my ideas about, more alternative ways of dealing with cancer. But, because of her husband's beliefs and, his mother's beliefs, they decided that, that she should do the chemo, which I was like, I didn't want her to do that, but that was what she chose. And I had to surrender the fact that I can't run her life. I can't make her do it the way I want her to do it. And so I've had to surrender having control. And even with Jesse, it's like, things are going to happen, things that we can't control. And so you do your best, you educate yourself, like, parents of young athletes. I would say, these are the things you need to look out for. But if you have a kid that has HCM, there are no guarantees. I mean, you could do everything right and they can still go. And even with Jesse, like, having my background in the healing arts, when he first died, I just blamed myself. I was so hard on myself. Why didn't I stop it? Why didn't I know? And it was probably a couple of years after he'd passed away, he came to me. It was one morning I was getting ready to go for the day, and the way he communicates with me is not through words, but just through downloads of understanding, and it just comes flooding in. And so I have to put words to it, but it doesn't come in the form of words. But he let me know. He said, if I'd been here, if I'd been at home, you would have stopped me from going. You wouldn't have let me go. And it happened the way it needed to happen. And so, and with the near-death experiences, I knew that you don't go before your time, but it's just hard to accept, especially when a young person dies. It's a hard, children aren't supposed to die before their parents.
Right.
And so to surrender to God's plan, to believe that God has a plan, even when it's really hard, to trust that I think that's the biggest surrender. And so with my daughter, it's like, you hope for the best, you plan for the best. I mean, and just recently she's going through, she's looking at doing chemo again, possibly. And so I just am like, well, I do everything I can that she will accept that I can do to help her. But, in the end, it's like, the saying, you hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And sometimes you that's part of the surrenders. You're like, okay, you accept God's will, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But you have faith and you hope for the best.
Yeah, absolutely. So the surrender is allowing others to choose, but also trusting God.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's hard. I think that is so much easier to talk about than it is to do. It's easy to say, well, give it to God, trust that everything will work out. Well, when it works out the way we think it should, then we're good, right? But when it works out how
contrary,
like a
to what we want.
son dying, that's when it's really, really hard.
Yeah.
And it takes, like you said, it takes years for you to stop blaming yourself and wishing you could have changed the outcome and just believing, okay, all right, it must have been meant to be, but it's not what I wanted.
Yeah. And so then the focus becomes, okay, help me to accept this, to live with it, to find new purpose. And so
praying that. Yeah. I can see that. And
there have been a number of books that have really helped me. I mean, so my previous study of near-death experiences, but there's a book called The Surrender Experiment by Michael A. Singer that was really powerful for me.
Ooh.
And he decided,
tell me why.
So he decided at one point that he was just going to accept whatever life put in his path and just totally trust. I don't know if he called it God, but the universe, whatever you want to call that higher power. And he lived his life in that way. And it's an amazing story. For me, it was a life-changing story because it's like, here's a person sharing his experience of living his life in that way.
Wow.
And it's powerful. It's a powerful way to live life.
Wow. We'll have to put a link to that in the show notes. That just sounds fascinating. I would love to read that. The Surrender Experiment
by Michael A. Singer.
Wow.
And then most people are familiar with brain cramp. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl.
Oh, yes. That's a good one.
There's so many powerful stories. And some of the stories that he shares of, he had his own loss. I can't even imagine, watching your whole family killed right in front of you.
Oh, I know, right?
And so when I hear stories like that, I'm like, well, maybe I don't have it so bad.
Right?
So.
Yeah. It helps you put it into perspective.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. So, you also talked about the journey of learning about grief and how different it affects different people differently.
Well, I mean, because, working in the healing arts for as long as I have, because I've had an office now where I work with people for over 20 years, I didn't really understand just what a hard hit grief could be, what it does to the brain. I mean, my short-term memory was just decimated. The simple everyday things I just couldn't remember. And you feel crazy. You're like, why can't I remember anything? And so there are things like that you just don't realize, the physical toll, the mental toll, what it does to you physically, emotionally, spiritually. I mean, you expect the emotional challenge.
Sure.
And the spiritual challenge, but a lot of people don't realize the physical. And I met a friend who had lost her son, and she told me, she said, plan on taking a lot of naps and just know that you're not going to be able to keep going at the rate that you had been going. And it was true. I didn't have the stamina. It really took the wind out of my sails for at least a couple of years, probably.
Yeah. It's like a new normal. I've had somebody else talk about that on the podcast, that it's coming back from a major loss like that. everything's different afterwards.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. As you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. That's very interesting. And so maybe just giving ourselves the permission to say, you know what, this is going to look different for me than it will for somebody else. Did you find that you and your spouse grieve differently, perhaps?
Yes. Yeah. And my husband, I mean, he's not the typical man. He shows his emotions. He'll cry. Sometimes I think he cries more than I do. I'm the one that I hide it, and I would wait and do my crying like late at night when I was by myself. But so we do it differently. And I'd heard that, a lot of parents divorce after the death of a child. And I came to understand why I think that, the reason I think that happens is you have two people who are just taken down. It's like two people struggling, both drowning. And when you have two drowning people, who's going to save who?
Yeah.
You both need someone to throw the life raft, or, you both need help. And so it's like you're not even in a position to, you do your best. And it'll bring you together in some ways because you have that common loss, but it's hard because you're just both struggling so deeply.
Yeah. So would you say the person that ends up throwing the life raft out is God then?
Yes. And there can be other, there can be friends, there can be, God works through earthly angels as well as heavenly angels. But yes, a lot of times it will come through God in many different ways.
What are some of the ways that you saw that life raft perhaps in your life after Jesse passed away?
It was interesting because I felt like Jesse, my book is not just my book, because it was like I just started bumping into authors, and it was like, his way of helping me have ideas, like the idea to write a book, and then finding people to help me actually do it. And feeling like, because my book it's a way of making sense, finding meaning. Viktor Frankl talks about finding meaning out of the loss. So for me, a way of finding meaning is helping other parents deal with the grief, understand HCM and what they can do to help protect their kids, understanding where some of the pitfalls might be, like with the school system. In fact, a neighbor of mine, her child had a severe peanut allergy, and every year she would have to go in to make sure that health plan was in place, because it would just, I don't know, sometimes there are problems, school systems, the programs don't work the way they're always supposed to. I found that there was only one nurse that covered like many, many schools. And so they're just, sometimes resources are spread thin. And so the parent, you are your child's first defense. You have to be the one that's going to watch out for them. If they have a life-threatening condition, you have to become the expert. Don't expect your doctor to know everything and to do everything that is needed.
Yeah.
You have to become the expert. Like, if Jesse had a medical ID, that might have made a difference. I don't know. I do know that the paramedics, because so many, drugs are such a problem, they were looking at drugs.
Right.
You have a healthy looking teenage kid collapse, and they're not thinking heart, they're thinking drugs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so, I've just, some of those problems that I recognize through our experience, I want to help people be aware of. So having medical ID could make a difference. Although the way they do it, I don't know if medical personnel really check for medical ID.
I
don't know.
Assume they would.
Well,
but I don't know. I'm not a medical person.
Yeah. Well, and then is a kid going to wear it?
Yes,
you get them
right.
the bracelet or the necklace, whatever. Are they going to wear it? I've thought about like medical tattoos, or anyway, I've had different ideas on how do you keep your kids safe as possible.
Yeah. No, I totally get it.
Yeah.
No, good, because anytime we go anywhere with our son that has low functioning autism, I have him wear a lanyard that says, I have autism, and if I'm lost, if for some reason he runs away from us, and we're not looking, please call this phone number.
Exactly. So so you've learned what you need to do to keep your child safe. And it's, so it's, whatever the problem is that you're dealing with, knowing what you need to do is important.
Yeah. So in a sense, you have become a lifesaver to other people. You become a voice to say, I totally get grief.
Mm-hmm.
Here's some tips that might help in your particular situation. And that's neat that you have been able to come full circle, Mm-hmm. And I think God uses us in that way once we have learned what we needed to learn to help us reach and influence others, mm-hmm. and be that earthly angel, to help.
Yeah.
That's really, really neat. We're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, would you mind telling us maybe some final tips and tell us a little bit also about your book?
Sure.
How many of you out there feel like your life is chaotic, crazy, and completely awful compared to the norm? What if I were to tell you that you are normal for you? I am so excited to announce that my book, Normal for Me by Tamara K. Anderson, is now available for purchase on Amazon. This book took me 10 years to write, and I share 20 years worth of lessons learned in my life detours, including being in a car accident and having 2 of my children diagnosed on the autism spectrum. In this book, I share the secrets of how I made it from despair to peace with God's help. I also include a bonus diagnosis survival guide at the very end of my Normal for Me book. The Diagnosis Survival Guide includes 12 tips to survive and thrive in tough times. Wouldn't you like to know what those are? So what are you waiting for? Grab your copy of Normal for Me today on Amazon.
And we're back. I'm talking to Elizabeth Allen about the lessons she learned after her son Jesse died from HCM, which is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy at age 16. Elizabeth, tell me a little bit about some of the tips that you would share with someone who is in a similar situation. We've talked about you becoming the expert in your child's diagnosis, so I know that's one of the tips you would share. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other tips that you would share about this?
Self-care is so important.
Right.
And so finding, it's going to be different for everybody. It might be taking a bath. For me, journaling was huge, writing poetry, and I mentioned my interest in near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. And there's actually a group here in Salt Lake, that they meet once a month. It was the last Friday of the month. I think it's in the county offices. You can find out more about it at IANDS.org. It stands for International Association of Near-Death Studies. And so anyway, going to those meetings was really helpful. And, hearing those stories, connecting with people who have, been there and back, who are connected to the other side was really helpful for me.
Yeah.
And
so these were things that kind of helped you heal. Mm-hmm. So taking care of yourself is crucial.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So find your passions. Make sure you make time for those things.
Yeah. Well, and then just, my family was important to me before, but, just when you realize that there's no guarantee for tomorrow, just hugging my kids every opportunity, telling them that I love them. And I tended to do that anyway, but it's just even more, and friends and people, just being appreciative of every moment of every day, because you don't know.
Yeah.
You really don't know.
It's true. And something like this reminds you of that, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It really does. Oh. Yeah. My priorities, it really, helps me keep a sharper perspective of what really matters in life.
Do you find it's easy to get distracted from that priority of keeping family so top notch? I mean, are you as easily distracted as you used to be? Let me ask it that way.
Well, it's not even always being distracted. I'm grateful to have my own business because I can adjust my schedule but having a business, and having to, schedule things. Sometimes I wish I had more time for my family. Like, I have a new granddaughter. Sometimes I feel like I can't be there as much as I want to be there. Or I wish that there were 3 of me. One to just go live with my daughter for a few months and help her, and one to just stay home and do dishes and bake bread, and one to go be in my office. Anyway.
It's a challenge to juggle everything.
Yeah.
And perhaps that is why that self-care is so important. In all our busyness, it's important to make time for us as well.
And so I find that I just have to schedule. I mean, my schedule, like, my daughter wanted me to, it's her husband's birthday today. She's like, can you come and watch the kids? I said, I can't that day, but I will give you this day. And so being able to, schedule the times when I can be there. And then when I'm there 100%. And so wherever I am, I'm there 100%.
Ooh, that is beautiful advice. I love that. Right?
So,
be present.
Yeah. And so if I'm at my office, I'm there 100%. And then when I'm done, then I get to focus on, my family or me or whatever needs the focus.
Yeah.
And being able to have flexibility. If something happens, then sometimes you have to just say, well, this came up, and then you have the flexibility to reschedule.
Absolutely.
So
that's awesome. So have you found a favorite Bible verse that has become meaningful to you in this amazing journey that you've been on?
Oh, there's so many. I like the story of Job. It really, that hit home in such a big way after everything. But one of my favorites is from James 1, verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. It's just such a great promise. And we're told to ask. And I think so many times we don't ask. And so asking, knowing that we're going to be given from a generous God who, our best, I really believe that our best interest is always what he wants for every one of his children. And I believe we are all God's.
Absolutely. Oh, that's beautiful. That is such a powerful verse that, God is going to give to us. We do need to ask. And sometimes we have to figure out the right thing to ask for.
Yes. Actually, that's so important. That's one of the things I pray for is help me to ask appropriately and with discernment.
Ooh, I like that word.
That's part of the surrender is, the not my will, but thine be done. Which is, that's probably the biggest place of surrender.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. My goodness, yes. What resources would you recommend? You've already given us a couple of books. Are there any other resources you would recommend for someone in a similar situation or someone who's struggling?
Yeah, it was interesting. When Jesse first died, I looked for some kind of grief group, and it took me, I think someone finally told me about Compassionate Friends, but they weren't, I didn't find them myself right away. But so that is a resource specifically for parents who have lost a child. And there are Facebook groups. And so if you just search for, whatever fits for you, like grief. I created a Facebook group called Their Light Shines On because I want the focus to be on, that they're there, that connection can be there and help people have hope in that. Because if you focus on, I mean, I've seen parents who just, it's like they just sink and they don't ever recover. Some people don't recover. They don't find the hope. They just, it's such a hard loss that they get lost in it and they have a hard time finding their way out. And so to have hope and to be able to look for the ways that they're showing up, to be able to feel that they're there. I think sometimes the grief creates such a big barrier. In fact, because of my grief, I think it kind of made it harder for me to feel Jessie. And it was interesting because a good friend of mine, she lost her daughter. And her daughter came to me in a dream and gave me a message for her mother. And I thought, how interesting that I would be able to have a dream and connect with her daughter easier than I could connect to my own son. And it's just because that grief it makes it hard for them to get through.
Isn't that interesting? You would think it would be the opposite, but it's not.
No. And so I've known people who have a really hard time because they don't feel connection. And that's the most painful thing, I think, is to desperately beg and pray for connection. And a lot of times, we expect it to be a dream or to be, to look a specific way, and that can blind us. And so
that we miss, kind of like you were talking about at the beginning.
And so the obvious is right there. It's like it's happening, but you just don't realize it.
So maybe the prayer should be to God, help me to notice.
Yes, help me to
see.
Yes,
to see.
Help me to see, help me to hear, help me to feel what is there. Help me to recognize the gifts that you're giving me that I'm being blind to.
Because of the grief. Yeah. No, that's so wise. That's beautiful. Awesome. You also mentioned a book called Tear Soup.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So a friend of mine, it's a large picture book, but so it can be appropriate for children as well as adults. And I loved that it addressed, the different ways that people grieve. We don't all grieve the same. And so it just talks about the depths of grief, the feelings of grief. People talk about, the 5 stages. Well, it definitely is not a clear-cut little cycle that you go through. It is very messy, and you bounce around and go back and forth, and you visit the anger multiple times.
Right.
And people, well-meaning people can say some hurtful, ignorant things at times, and because they just don't know, they don't realize. And so, and part of my message is just helping people who haven't gone through the loss to understand what is helpful.
Why don't you tell us what is helpful? What helped you? So
telling someone who's had some deep loss, oh, well, they're in a better place. Don't ever say that.
That is so good to know.
Do not say that. Because if the person already believes it, it diminishes the feeling of loss that they're going through and the devastation. And, they miss that person. It doesn't matter if they're in heaven. It doesn't make you miss them any less.
Right.
Right. I know Jesse's in heaven. I know he's busy. I know he's, doing great stuff. But there are times when I just miss him. Yeah. And revisiting, going back, revisiting the actual grief is always painful. I mean, it's never less painful.
Like on anniversaries and stuff like that.
Or just remembering, going back to the memories. They're just, in fact, I took a class from a man who'd lost a son, and he said, you don't ever grieve less, you just grieve less often. And I think that's very true.
Oh, so that is really well put.
So the depth of grief never diminishes, but revisiting that, that first year especially, where you're going through all those firsts, is just brutal. And I had a friend who's lost 2 children, and she said, the second year, she said, I hate to tell you, the second year isn't a lot easier. So anyway, it just, it's just hard. It's hard to miss them. It's, driving past the high school for a few years was just hard, because you're always thinking, what would he be doing now? And what would I be doing now? What would be different now?
What other tips would you give to people who have a friend who is grieving like that?
Just be there, and you don't even have to say anything. In fact, there's a movie I watched, and they were just sitting. They were just there knitting and just showing support and love. I mean, you don't even have to say anything. Just be there. And, we had so much love pouring out towards us. Food was brought in. And sometimes there can be too much food. So ask, what do you like to eat? What sounds good for you? Well, because when someone's, fresh in the grief, it's like your appetite it can be hard to eat even. So.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
And so just being aware of what is hard and just being mindful. You don't have to say, just say, I'm sorry. Just saying, I'm sorry. And then someone who's lost a child, they love to talk about their child. And so giving them, just listening, asking them about their child is a huge gift. Because a lot of times people will have the attitude, well, aren't you over it yet? It's like, guess what? They're never going to be over it. You don't get over that kind of loss. It changes you.
Yeah.
And you don't ever stop missing them.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe a good idea would be it's okay to bring that kid up, or whoever that has passed on, and say, I was thinking about them the other day, and I remember this one time, and sharing that experience with you.
Sharing memories is such a treasure. In fact, I created a journal, and I wrote down all the dreams that people had. I'm so glad that I did that. So, those dreams that I was wishing for that I didn't get to have, at least I got to enjoy other people's dreams and the way that Jesse would show up and the messages that he had for people, and the ways that he's shown up to help protect. Like I had a nephew that was going through a really hard time with drug use, and Jesse came and kind of smacked him upside the head and said, "Knock it off." So, and
sometimes they're nice, and sometimes they're,
they
kind of being a little strict with us, but sometimes that's what we need to hear, right?
Well, and he was, and my nephew, he was headed out. He had, was out of his body, and he said Jesse pushed him back in and said, not time for you to go yet. And
stay here.
Start taking care of yourself.
Isn't it interesting that they really are so involved in the lives of those that they still love? Yeah. That doesn't go away. And that they'll show up in people that we know, family, friends, their lives.
Yeah, we've heard multiple stories. My husband's niece, they were in a car accident, and she talked about how she felt, and they were protected, and she felt like it was Jesse that protected them. So I love hearing those stories. I love the memories that people have shared, like some of the most precious things that people did after Jesse died was just sharing those memories of him. You love hearing those stories. And, you think your child, but after they pass away, that's when you realize how much you didn't know about them. So you learn a lot about someone after they pass away.
So maybe even writing a memory in a letter or a text or something, because then you can keep it.
Yes. Yeah. Those are very precious. I have a notebook where I saved all those, the cards, the letters.
Yeah. That's a fantastic idea. I love that. That's really, really cool. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your book that you've written?
So my book, Heart So Big, is about my journey. So the beginning, the chapter where we go to the hospital and see his body, I'm so glad that we got to have that time with his body before the autopsy and everything.
Mm.
But, it's pretty heart-wrenching. It was heart-wrenching to go through. It's heart-wrenching to read. But then there's the part I love the most about my book is, the ways that I've connected. I explain grief and what you can do about grief, how you need to, getting the right supplements to help your brain recover from the loss is important.
Yeah. That's part of the self-care, right?
Yes. So as part of the self-care is the getting proper nutrition, and then just how to recognize that they're there. And I'm hoping that my story will help spark in other people the idea that they are there, and to know what to look for, and to be open to recognizing the different ways that they show up. And then and to educate parents about HCM, especially parents of young athletes, and to know what they can do to help get their child diagnosed, especially if they, have a kid who they kind of think might be having some kind of physical problems. And then just, working with the schools, bringing more awareness to even emergency medical personnel. If a kid collapses, it might be a heart situation.
Right, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
And I think that there's more focus on having AEDs in schools and people, to help people be aware of the necessity and how to use those kinds of tools and equipment.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So if people have just really resonated with your story and your message, how do they get a hold of you? How do they find you?
So my email is eallenhealth@gmail.com. You can send me an email. And if you just put Heart So Big, then maybe I'll know that it was, from this podcast, or that you're interested in my book. And then my website, Heart So Big, it's kind of bare bones right now, but it is there. So
awesome.
So that's another way that you can get in touch with me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Tell me, are there any final tips that you would like to share before we close? Be gentle with yourself. Know that your best is good enough. And because sometimes we can be so hard on ourselves, and realizing that your best is good enough, and that most people are doing their best, and recognizing that they're doing their best. And so if someone says something that you find hurtful, just give them the benefit of the doubt, recognize that they are doing their best, and don't take it personally. Just let it go. Beautiful. Beautiful words to end by. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing such a beautiful and heartfelt story with us today. Thank you, Tamara. It was such a pleasure and honor to be here.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to today's show. I know that there are many of you out there that are going through a hard time, and I hope you found things that have been useful today as you listen to the podcast. If you would like to access the show notes from today's podcast, visit my website. It is storiesofhopepodcast.com. That is where you'll find favorite quotes from today's episode and shareable memes. And those are fun because you can share them with your friends on social media. You will also find the links mentioned throughout today's episode, so you don't have to remember what those were. And also all the tips that were shared. Sometimes tips are shared so much throughout an episode you forget. What were those great things? So go to the show notes, storiesofhopepodcast.com, to look up these fantastic resources. If someone kept coming to mind during today's episode, perhaps that means that you should share this with them. Maybe there was a story shared or a tip that they really, really need to hear. So go ahead and share this episode with them. May God bless you, especially if you are struggling, with hope to carry on and with the strength to keep going when things get tough. Remember to walk with Christ, and He will help bear that burden. Above all else, remember, God loves you.